I've driven and traveled to Austin, to Washington, D.C., and other places. I've interviewed people in different states, just trying to bring some type of a human perspective to the suffering that is caused to individuals and the destruction of families that takes place at the hands of our government or the government agencies. I've been threatened to be sued probably, I'm guessing, half a dozen times, or by at least half a dozen different individuals. I even had a church in Rockwall, Texas, that said if I came back to the church and I was asking them for help with a problem, and the church told me that if I came back, that I would be subject to being arrested for trespassing. It was a church that I used to attend, but I'm looking at this whole issue in a broader context of the family. I do not see how we can have a strong nation or a strong state when we are tearing apart families for no reason whatsoever, indiscriminately, at will, and we are legalizing this. And we are breaking down the relationship between parents and their children and grandparents and their grandchildren.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeff Morgan. I flew in last night from Dallas, Texas. You know, I got involved in this a few years back, and like many of you, I got blindsided. And, you know, and at the beginning, you're like, what do? You have no idea what to do. And I was glad to see that there were people around, people that have gone ahead of us to give us some ideas. Brian Kinter, Don Rufty, John Gentry, I just heard of for the first time today, but so many people that when you're going through it at the beginning, you're like, I don't even know how to begin to handle this stuff. You just caught so off guard. There's a sense of shame, embarrassment, everything that accompanies it. But you know, I was watching the TV the other night, and there was a screenshot from all of these different tobacco companies, and in the shot, they had to acknowledge that they had created cigarettes, that nicotine was actually an addictive substance, and they had created cigarettes so that you could create and sustain addiction. And this was something that they had denied forever. When I think about some of the stuff we're talking about, I look at the whole umbrella of the family abuse and family destruction industry. And the entire industry and all facets of it are built on lies. So take, for example, the tobacco industry. Many years, they told us that they denied that smoking causes cancer. They denied that nicotine was addictive. They denied that they were marketing to our young kids. They denied the damage of secondhand smoke. They wanted to make a safer cigarette, but then they said, boy, if we make a safer cigarette, we're going to actually be acknowledging that there's danger here. How many people have died, emphysema, lung cancer, other things, because of cigarette smoking? And I understand that people smoke here. I'm not referencing that, but fun of us. No, I'm not doing that.
We're just trying to stay warm.
Yeah, just trying to stay warm, exactly. But you know, I used to be a missionary overseas, and I heard this complaint from people overseas. The cigarette companies are giving our kids free cigarettes. They have these parties, and they're giving them free cigarettes. Why? So they will have lifetime customers. It did not matter how many people were damaged or killed along the way. It was an industry that was built on profiting off of the destruction of individuals. I read one report recently that said by the year 2030, they anticipate 10 million people a year actually being dying because of cigarette smoking. The abortion industry. You look at the abortion industry. For how many years did they say, that's not a living person, that's not a living baby inside of a woman, that's just a blob of cells. Abortion is a loving thing to do. You don't want to trap this girl or whatever in a lifetime of poverty. Abortion is a private decision between a mother and her daughter. Poor people need to have abortions. Or sometimes, if you look at the history of it, certain ethnic groups needed to have abortions. Lack of abortion is cruel and inhumane. You look at Roe versus Wade, since then we've had 60 million babies or more that have been killed. Another industry that destroys families based on lies. More recently, what we've been focusing on in Texas is the divorce industry. If you've seen the movie Divorce Corp, You know some of the damages that if you have not seen it, I urge you to see it. $50 billion a year industry. Now, what type of lies did the divorce people tell us? Kids just want their parents to be happy. No, kids want their parents to learn to love each other and get along and keep the family together. Kids are resilient. No, kids have been broken and silenced. It's what's going on. You look at Judith Wallerstein and her book, The Unexpected Legacy of Divorce, a 25-year study. Judith Wallerstein thought there would be no problem with divorce. She studied a group of people, white, middle class or upper middle class, people who wanted to have an amicable divorce. 25 years later, she kept on following up on these people. The results were devastating. Devastating. Imagine what happens to our poorer communities, the different minority communities. Another lady just recently, Lila Miller, wrote the book Primal Loss. The now adult children of divorce speak out. 70 people that are speaking out on what happened to them during divorce. How it basically, the words that they use, loss, devastation. It led to antisocial behavior, sociopathic behavior, all of these different things. We've been told kids are resilient. No, they've been broken. And many times they've been silenced. By the way, in Texas, if you want to talk about issues of constitutionality and opposing unconstitutional laws, we are planning again to challenge the issue of no-fault, that is unilateral divorce. Because in no-fault divorce, in the majority of instances, by far, one person is forcing divorce on another person. That person has no rights. No due process rights that we're talking about. Why should we be surprised if we don't get due process rights in family court when from the very beginning we don't have due process rights? Or our children don't have due process rights? We need to go back to that. I'd encourage you to watch Texas next year. We are going to be challenging this once again, and I think we have a better chance of actually getting it repealed. By the way, unilateral divorce violates the state policy of the state of Texas. So why is the state of Texas saying, this is our policy, but we're allowing this practice to destroy families? The child support enforcement industry, another industry that destroys families. And I can speak about Texas. Back in October of last year, I was at a meeting when our Attorney General, Ken Paxton, was speaking, and I asked him a question about meeting with this one transgender family. They had a young son who was transgendering. And I asked him, give me some clarification. What about and he gave us a reason, and I said, would you be willing to meet with the parents of children who feel that the divorce, the child support orders that you put upon them, the way that you enforce them is abusive? And he said yes. So as he's walking out, I said, well, how do we get a hold of you to do this? So he gave me a name and somebody's number. I put out a YouTube video, and before you knew it, all these people were calling up the Attorney General's office complaining. And this one lady's taking the calls, and she's saying, yours sounds like it's a particularly bad case. And the guy would say, oh no, mine's not bad at all. It's as if there was this big disconnect. The Attorney General of the state of Texas, I've been to his meetings. I actually voted for him. I think in a number of ways he's good. I think in child support and what he does to help destroy families is horrendous. It's going to be tough, though, to convince other people about that. They love him because he has sued President Obama so many times. And in fact, our governor and the Attorney General used to have these conversations about who's sued Obama the most, who's on track to suing him the most. This comes directly from the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton. However, when you look at the child support enforcement industry, and I'm calling it industry, it's a state-sponsored industry. The Office of the Attorney General, 62% of its staff is devoted to collecting child support. It's not devoted to finding out whether the child support is even just. It just takes whatever the judge gives, and they will enforce that. He employs over 4,200 people. Over 2,600 people are responsible for enforcing child support. He has a webpage up. that if you are behind in child support, you can be listed as a child support evader, and he will enlist the services of the public. Would you please report this person to us? Now, I've got friends who have gone through this. One of my friends, and I'm going to mention some names because I'm sure they will not mind. Josh Jaros, outstanding man. He was going to be a missionary with New Tribes Mission. If not, he was going to be a youth minister. His wife divorced him, and of course, with a consolation prize from being forcefully divorced, you get child support. You don't get to see your kids, you get child support. He owes less than $2,000. He was recently up to be indicted for, they were going to charge him with 3 counts of contempt because he owed less than $2,000. And the only reason he owed that little amount was because his parents were sending him their Social Security money from Minnesota to keep him out of jail. Josh is an outstanding man, but he's being punished because he can't pay. And yet he's also there for his children all the time. Somehow this is called being in the best interest of the children when the Attorney General puts him into jail. The interesting thing was at this one meeting that I was at, the Attorney General talked about how much money the state of Texas made by enforcing child support. He bragged, and we still brag in our state, that Texas is the #1 state in collecting child support over the past 10 years. Last year, they collected over $4 billion. Another man, a friend of mine, Gabriel Cornejo, paternity fraud. The Office of the Attorney General knows he is not the father of the child, and yet they're trying to extort him for $70,000 in child support. Gabriel is not going down without a fight, and that's good. Another instance in which the Office of the Attorney General is helping to destroy families, I've got friends Michael and Natasha Dry. We've talked about some of the false accusations made against people. Brian Kinter talked about the false accusations made against him. Michael Dry has had these accusations made against him. In this instance, CPS actually, I believe, came to his aid and said he's not guilty of this stuff. And yet the Office of the Attorney General will still try to throw him in jail and prosecute him. Story after story I've been told from people throughout Texas in which the destruction of the family takes place for financial reasons, and it's happening with state sanction. Children's Protective Services, which is what we're here for. Nancy Schaefer, I didn't even know about her until just a little bit ago, a few years ago. My instance is how I got involved with the story of Child Protective Services is 3 years ago. My daughter took my grandson to a hospital because he had a circumcision that got infected. The hospital called Children's Protective Services, and somehow in the course of that, I got blamed. My grandchildren, I was the one that was watching them for about 8 months, almost exclusively. My daughter wasn't watching the kids. My son wasn't watching the kids. My ex-wife was not watching the kids. My daughter would call me all the time to come watch the kids, and my wife. And yet Children's Protective Services, Children's Protective Services, to some degree, knew that we were innocent because when they were investigating my daughter, the reason they stopped the investigation is because they said, you have a grandparent who is a very strong safety net. And yet they would not tell her that I had nothing to do with the call, so I got sued. I have not seen my grandchildren now for 3 years, and that's how I got involved in this. But we talk about Children's Protective Services. I like to call them Family Destruction Services because that's what they do. Last Thursday, we were at a meeting in Austin when they talked about the Department of Protective and Family Services. How do they preserve families? It's a laughable matter. They don't. To most people, when you talk about Children's Protective Services, nothing but fear comes to their mind. To paraphrase Ronald Reagan, some of the most terrifying words in the English language are, we're from Children's Protective Services, and we're here to help you. Yeah. They're not here to help you. They're here to try to take away your children. When I was going to Children's Protective Services begging them to speak out on my behalf, they refused to do so. But you know what the first thing was? Do we need to take the children out of the home? They don't want to help. They want to destroy families. Again, when I first started to testify, it was when Liliana Wright, a girl who had been reported to Children's Protective Services on multiple occasions, was killed because of the failure of CPS. I have another friend, Ron McCall. The same thing happened. Children's Protective Services considered him guilty of sexual molestation, even though there was no evidence in the matter. He had a trial jury. He was found innocent. His ex-wife was able to go home, at which point she shot and killed her son and shot and killed herself. Children's Protective Services. Another man, a friend of mine, not from Texas, Hal Stanley. Children's Protective Services came to his house to take away his children. They had snipers in his front yard in case he did not comply. All of these people have died by the negligence of Children's Protective Services. But I think that these failures, as awful as they were, pale in comparison to the destruction that they inflict upon families who are falsely accused. And that's why we're here, because Nancy Schaefer was actually investigating those things, the abuses of the services. I've listened to some of the people here, and I've talked with a few people. Anything that I've gone through pales in comparison to what you've gone through. So I guess after listening to Don Rufty and Brian Kinter and then John Gentry, here's what my strategy has been. And I don't know that it's the right strategy, but I do know how, I've talked with a few people and they say it's so embarrassing. We can't talk about this. We haven't even told our church friends because it's embarrassing. It reflects bad on us. When I got falsely accused of reporting my daughter to Children's Protective Services, when I had her sue me, when I had my ex-wife go up there commit perjury against me, when I have not now been able to see my grandchildren as of this point for 3 years, of course it's embarrassing. But there's the point that we need to step outside of our embarrassment and go forward, because as many people have said, we're not fighting this for ourselves. I'm fighting this for my grandchildren, Cruz and Gideon Morgan. If we don't draw the line, what's it going to be in the future? It's going to get worse. I've been impressed by so many people that have spoken that, like I am also a military veteran. And they've said, we swore to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. I've been impressed by so many people of faith. People that have said, not bad people, people of faith. And it seems like sometimes they're being picked on. So I look at the church and I say, the church should be an ally to us, right? It should be an ally to us. And yet too often, the church is a bystander to the destruction. I think about when Jesus talked about the man who was beaten, and the priest walked and saw the man who was beaten and walked by on the other side of the street. And the Levite saw the man who was beaten and left for half dead and walked by on the other side of the street. And I'm sure, well, I can't say she's positive, maybe they even prayed for him. We'll pray for you. But we're not going to get involved. And it was a Samaritan. In that culture, the despised Samaritan, who showed mercy, who said, I will pick up this person, tend to his wounds, take him to a place where he can heal. And which one of those people was the neighbor? The Samaritan. I thought about the testimony of Rachel Den Hollander. She's the gymnast who first went public with a sexual abuse charge against Larry Nassar. She is an evangelical Christian. And she saw that the biblical teachings about grace and repentance were being, what she called, weaponized against victims. Here's what she said about the church. Church is one of the least safe places to acknowledge abuse because the way it is counseled. More often than not, damaging to the victim. There is an abhorrent lack of knowledge for the damage and devastation that sexual assault, or may I add, false allegations, or may I add, having your children taken away by the state. There's a lack of knowledge of what's going on. It is with deep regret that I say the church is one of the worst places to go to for help. What I think we need to be doing is making our case to the churches as well, that we have been many times, that we have been falsely accused. That in many instances, children that are being taken away for no purpose whatsoever. At the meeting on Thursday, we discussed about how many children, I was reading about how many calls were made to CPS, and I believe in 2016, it was about 175,000. They acted on 67,000, 68,000. 48,000 of those calls dealt with negligent supervision. What is negligent supervision? Is your child playing outside and you go to the bathroom, and while you're going to the bathroom, the child falls and scuffs up his head? What is this negligent supervision? Almost 70% of the cases were negligent supervision. No danger, no harm, but we're CPS and we're here to help you. And we're here to put you in a program that will destroy your family. I think maybe I've been a little bit scattered in what I'm talking about right now, but I've thought, what did I do? Because I've heard some people say, it's so hard to know what to do. Nobody knows what to do when this hits you at the beginning. Now, Don Ruffty and his sons worked for the Ron Paul campaign in 2008, 2012. I actually worked for the Rick Santorum campaign, so I may just, whether you guys had a better ground game, you had a great ground game, but I was very actively involved in the Santorum campaign. Some of the stuff I started to do, I said, I see a need here. I'm going to start to do something because people will see how poorly I do it. Somebody will say, please, Brother Jeff, can you sit down and let me take over? That's not the way it happened. Usually it was like 2 weeks later they thought I was the expert, and I think this is really bad for our campaign. However, you just start to do something, and you know that you see the people here. We're all linking up with other people. Last September, I met Don Ruffty. We were at a meeting in a park. Don Ruffty starts to speak, and I had my video camera with me about prosecuting the crooked judges. It was amazing. Don, I want to thank you for what you gave. So when I ended up through this court case with CPS, because I had to defend myself twice, I was innocent. The second one was dismissed. But my ex-wife got up and committed perjury against me. This was a good opportunity to teach me a lesson or something. I have no clue what was going on. So I decided to take her to small claims court. I thought, how do I do this to say that I don't want to sue her? I don't want to see her go into bankruptcy, but I do want my daughter to reestablish the relationship with me. My daughter reacted on a false report. My family, my relationship was destroyed with my grandchildren. 2 months or 3 months prior, she wrote, Dad, I hope you're always close to Cruz and Gideon because you're good for them. And if you are close to them, I know they're going to turn out okay. This is what she wrote to me. Several months later, she's suing me in court. So I thought, how do I reestablish this thing? And the only way I could do it was to try to say, well, if I take my ex-wife to small claims court, the judge knew it was perjury. I'm sure that the small claims court will also rule, Miss Wygant, my ex-wife, Miss Wygant, the evidence shows that you've committed perjury. The judge knew exactly what I was in there for. The judge chose, as people have mentioned, to suppress the evidence. He chose to dismiss the case without cause. So, following the example of my brother Don Ruffty over there, I filed a complaint against him with the State Commission for Judicial Conduct. Now, it's a small claims court, but I'm like, okay, at least something may happen. I will know on April the 9th, and trust me, no matter how they respond, I'm ready to go public. I think that when we talk about addressing these issues, the family destruction industry, we need to go public, get other people on our side. I would hope that the church would also start to join us as well. What I do know is this. Several years ago, when I started to go through this stuff, it was if God spoke to me, and people of faith here, so I can say this. In the Old Testament, God asked Moses, what is in your hand? And he said, just a rod, right? And it was as if God said to me, what's in your hand? And I said, well, a video camera. To which he said, use it. And I thought, do you have any idea what you're asking me to do? I don't even know how to use this thing. But it seems like for whatever reason, somehow, it has been being used by God. I've been contacted by people throughout the state, throughout the U.S., from other countries, people that have said, we're going forward based on this information because I've been able to record some outstanding people and because we're trying to make change. There's one guy in New York who's trying to repeal unilateral divorce, and they're based primarily on testimonies that we gave down in Texas. What I do know is this: silence is not an option. And when I worked with this Rick Santorum campaign, people used to ask him, but Rick, what should I do? He would say, I don't know, but do something. Do something. And that's all we're doing, is doing something. God gave you a voice. Use it. God gave you something. Use it. And as somebody said, maybe he's taking these things that you have no skill, no ability in, so that he gets the glory. I also want to address grandparents. I am a grandparent. And as I've said, it's because I'm a grandparent that I'm fighting and that I'm not going to stop with this, because I do not want to see my grandchildren destroyed. Grandparents, you have a lot of strength. You are the largest voting bloc in the United States of America. Many of you grandparents have time and money. And many of you have been told that maybe you're useless or past your prime or something. You are not. Grandparents love their grandchildren. They may not be doing it for themselves, but grandparents, I beg you, get involved for the sake of your grandchildren. If you don't, these things will get worse. I want to thank Ted for organizing this. Nancy Schaefer. I am grateful for what she did and for the letter that her son sent.
I've driven and traveled to Austin,
to be
to
here to honor
Washington,
her
D.C. and
memory,
other places.
and
I've interviewed
to continue the work on behalf of families that she began. Thank you for letting me speak for a few minutes. And thank you to all of you, John Gentry, Don Ruffey, Brian Kinter, the many other people that I've spoken with here. You, Terry, you've given me, there's so many times you want to quit. So many times you say, is it worth it? I'm driving up here thinking, I'm from Dallas. What am I doing here today? But you keep making one extra step. You don't know when that step is going to be the one that may crack this thing wide open. Thank you so much.